Hi there, my name is Simone Eringfeld. I recently completed an MPhil in Education and International Development at the University of Cambridge at the Faculty of Education. And in this video, I will be presenting to you very briefly my article that I contributed to Search called Equitable Education, Opportunity and Entrepreneurship within the Spatiotemporal Liminality of the Refugee Camp. So my research has in part focused on refugee education, and in this article I am investigating the question of equity in education applied to the context of the refugee camp. So the Sustainable Development Goals emphasize that equitable education is something that we should be extending to all students. But what do we mean when we say equity? And what does that mean when we apply it to the context of a refugee camp, particularly a camp where people settle, where people stay for a very long time? What are the specific needs of people in those spaces that might change the way in which we think about equity in education? So in this article, I am taking a very theoretical approach, and I am providing you with a literature review on different ways in which we have been thinking about equity. Particularly very influential thinkers like Amartya Sen and his capability approach, as well as John Rawls and his theory of justice, which have been very influential in how we think about equity. And in this article, I basically make the argument that some of the assumptions underlying their theories become problematic when we look at the refugee camp, which I conceptualize as a space which is very much marked by liminality, both in a spatial sense and in a temporal sense, because as UNHCR defines camps, they are supposed to be temporary places. But what happens is that people are increasingly settling and remaining there for longer. So you're sort of stuck in limbo, in between. It's a space of transition, but when you get stuck in that transition, what does that mean? And what kind of education would refugee students need within this sort of space of liminality? And I am arguing that rather than being focused on preparing for a future outside of the camp, which might never arrive, we need to be looking at, okay, how can we provide equitable education that is of use in the here and now of the camp as well? So I am approaching this through a triangular structure of the refugee camp, the refugees themselves, and the concept of equity, all within this larger context of spatial temporal liminality. And I bring in another approach, which is a more, rather than a focus on dependency, it's a shift towards self-reliance, and it's a shift from distribution models, which Sen and Rawls offer us, to a model which is more focused on helping refugees create their own opportunities, their own models for education, which might be more useful within the here and now of the camp itself. And all of this is very much shaped by my own visits to Nakivale, a refugee settlement camp in Uganda, where I have observed firsthand how refugees have started to create their own schools for entrepreneurship, so that students may come in and receive an education which is very much self-driven. It's non-formal, but it might be a lot more helpful because it's less focused on preparing for a future outside, which again might not come, towards creating a sustainable livelihood here and now. So what I argue in my article is that we need to reassess and reconsider what we mean by education when we apply these concepts to very different spaces, particularly spaces of liminality. And I argue that these approaches towards entrepreneurship, which are non-formal and self-led, might be a very interesting way for us to expand this notion of equity in education. I do highlight that there are also issues in this approach, particularly the relation to neoliberal ideas around who is supposed to be responsible for creating opportunities here and now. But nevertheless, I do think that this might be something that we need to dive into in future research. I hope that was helpful, and I really recommend that you read the article for some enhanced detail and a full explanation of my article. Thank you so much for listening.